Good morning, everyone. This is Debbie Rauscher with the John Burton Advocates for Youth. Welcome to this morning's webinar. It's about 3 minutes to 10 o'clock, so we're going to give folks a few minutes to continue to log on, and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good morning to those of you who are just joining us. We're going to get started with the webinar in just about 1 minute. We still have folks logging on, so we'll get started right at 10 o'clock. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar on supporting homeless students. This is Debbie Rauscher with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, a couple of logistical pieces of information. Many of you are probably listening on your computer, which is fine, but if you have trouble with the audio at any point, you can also listen through your phone, which sometimes works better, and the call-in number is there on your screen and is also available on the control panel. If you have questions during the web seminar, you can use the questions panel on the control panel to submit them. You can just type your question in, and questions related to presentation content we'll be doing at the end of the presentation. So after all of our panelists have spoken, we'll go ahead and get to the questions that folks have submitted. Also wanted to let you know that we are recording this morning's webinar, and the recording of the webinar as well as the PowerPoint presentation will be posted on our website after the webinar is complete, and I will be sending out a link to everybody who's on the webinar this morning so that you can get the PowerPoint. I also want to point out that on your control panel there's something called handouts. And there's a couple of handouts posted there that you can download now if you'd like. One is a handout of this PowerPoint. Sometimes people like to print it out and be able to take notes as they go along. So if you would like to print out the PowerPoint, you can download it from the handouts there and go ahead and do that. Also, there is a homeless crosswalk, which I'm going to be talking about a little later in the presentation, and that will be sent out with the link as well at the end of the webinar, but you can also go ahead and download it from the handout section if that's something you'd like to do. So I'm really excited today to have 3 panelists joining me on the webinar. So we've got Shahira Hyatt, who's the director of the California Homeless Youth Project, Jessica Smith, who is the statewide FYSI liaison, that's the Foster Youth Success Initiative, for those who aren't familiar with it, and she's with the Foundation for California Community Colleges. Myself, of course, with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and Bianca Bisi, who's the Student Equity Coordinator with Imperial Valley College. So I'm thrilled to have all of them on this morning's webinar to share their knowledge with you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shahira.
Hello, everyone. Shahira here. So as Debbie said, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the landscape of student homelessness. So the California Homeless Youth Project kind of aims to educate policymakers on the needs of young people experiencing homelessness in our state. So Debbie, I'm not sure if you talked a little bit over the agenda, but we can go ahead and skip to the next slide. Great. So there are homeless college students? Well, if you're on this webinar, you probably know that yes, in fact, there are. And we've actually had some great research coming out of the state of California to get a better handle on what's happening here. So in California, we know that about 1 in 10 CSU students, California State University students, is experiencing some form of homelessness. And in their research, what they're talking about when they say homelessness is they mean anybody lacking essentially a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So really similar to the same definition that we use in K through 12 education. So that can look like living doubled up or couch surfing, staying in emergency or temporary housing, staying outside in abandoned buildings or bus depots or your car, situations like that. We also know that there was an internal survey done with community college faculty and staff where over 90% said that they see homelessness as a problem or an issue coming up on their campus, yet only 15% said they felt capable to respond. And I thought that was a really important statistic to kind of outline that we know this is an issue happening on college campuses, but our knowledge about how to address it is really lacking. So we need each other to kind of build this knowledge base. When we interviewed over 200 young people experiencing homelessness across the state, we found that 90% of young people, and these were particularly folks that were staying outside, had career goals like becoming a social worker, a nurse, or a teacher, which we all know requires extensive education to achieve. So these young people want to attend school. They see education as a potential pathway out of poverty, but a lot of times their barriers to attending college are too great or to staying in college. Next slide. So just last year, one of the largest national studies on college homelessness came out in the country. This was from the Wisconsin Hope Lab, and it's called Hungry and Homeless in College. The results of their study were really staggering, even to me, somebody who's been working in this field of homelessness for almost a decade now. They found that 14% of community college students across the country are having an episode of literal homelessness. So that's defined as staying in a shelter, a car, abandoned building, or sleeping outside. And then fully half are housing insecure. So couch surfing or not able to pay rent, don't know how long they can stay. Maybe they're not on the lease. It might be, one young person living with other people just for a temporary situation with no security. Maybe they don't have a key or other factors could be present making it an unsafe situation. Further, they found that nationally 30% of these students, community college students, were experiencing food insecurity across the country, and that number was as high as 40% in California. So I know sometimes in California we think that we've got our stuff together, but actually it's been really hard to meet the food needs of college students. Another interesting thing about this study was they found out that the communities most likely to be having an episode of literal homelessness were former foster youth and parenting students, and that these students were equally likely to be working, but they were less likely to be making at least $15 an hour. And so I think that also kind of challenges some of the myths that we have about who is experiencing homelessness and why. A lot of these young people, these students are working, but it's not enough to meet their needs. Next slide, please. So how do young people become homeless? Well, we know that family conflict and system failure are two of the major trajectories into homelessness for young people. And I won't really specifically go over each one of these statistics, but we look at abuse and neglect, physical and sexual abuse, and parental substance use is often something that is a precursor to young people leaving their home. Sometimes young people are kicked out because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In fact, 20 to 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ, which is a really vast overrepresentation of that community. Pregnancy is another factor that sometimes causes young people to leave the home, either forced out or kicked out. And then we know that homelessness forces families apart. So a lot of young people experiencing homelessness also come from families who are experiencing homelessness. In fact, that's true for 47% of young people. And that was true for me as well. So I think especially as, in this kind of transition aged youth, when it's an older teenager or a young adult and families don't have enough resources to be able to meet the need of everybody, that young people take off on their own and try to find their own solutions. But we know that unfortunately there isn't a lot of help out there in terms of housing that's developmentally appropriate for youth and young adults. The last thing that we look at is system failure. So we think about exiting foster care or juvenile justice system. About 30% of foster youth will experience homelessness at some point after exiting foster care. And many homeless young people come directly from juvenile detention centers. And we need to do a better job of creating long-term plans to meet the needs of these young people who are exiting systems that really are our responsibility. I actually just heard a statistic last week that nationally, almost 50,000 adults exit the criminal justice system into homelessness in our country each year. So this is a problem not just for young folks, but for adults across America. Great. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that homeless students face. So for us in doing our research, we talk really directly with young people experiencing homelessness, and they talk about a lack of supportive adults, right? So when you're experiencing homelessness, that often means not just economic poverty, but also relationship poverty, or some people refer to it as network impoverishment. We know that mental health issues and the impact of trauma is really huge. Homelessness in and of itself is a traumatic experience, but usually doesn't happen in isolation, as we saw from the last slide. A lot of times there's a lot of trauma that leads up to an experience of homelessness that's further compounded by that incident. There's not a lot of support for educational planning and developing study skills. So the soft and hard skills that you need to be successful in school. And then inadequate financial resources. So we know, like I mentioned, many students are working and receiving aid, but there's a gap between what they make or what they receive and the cost of attending college. And fee and tuition waivers aren't enough. Associated costs like housing, transportation, food, books, and technology are a big part of the cost of going to school. And when they don't have enough money to meet those needs, they often over-rely on things like payday loans, using credit cards, having to decide between food and books, or simply dropping their classes. And that's not a position any of us want students to be in. Next slide. So we've done some focus groups with young people, students experiencing homelessness, and we asked them, what do you need to be successful in school? And the number one thing that we heard was connection to positive, supportive adults. And again, I think that underscores this idea of sort of like relationship poverty. They talked about wanting adults to ask them, are you going to school? What do you want to be doing? How are things going? And then also navigating, financial aid, supportive services on campus, just motivation, encouragement, and the actual knowledge needed to be able to get into a system that's actually pretty confusing for a lot of us. They said they needed stability. So a lot of times the support they wanted didn't really have anything to do just with school. It was also about, it's difficult to meet your educational needs and you can't meet your basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. So we know that students do really impressive and incredible things, even when they can't meet their needs. But again, it's not really setting them up well for success. They also said they wanted more knowledge of existing campus support programs and resources. They recommended using social media, word of mouth, posters and flyers. One of the things that I've sort of heard is that a lot of times colleges feel like they know the resources they have won't meet the need. And so sometimes that's used as a justification not to really promote the supportive services on campus. And what I would advocate for instead is to really promote your services well, but then document how many students you have to turn away for lack of either funding or staff capacity, and use that in advocacy strategy. So try to gather that data so that you can continue to build the services for this community. Great, next slide. So I just want to go over a handful of significant laws that have passed in the last couple of years that really speak to the needs of college students experiencing homelessness. So the first one, a key bill that will get into much more specifically a little bit later, but AB 801, the Success for Homeless Youth in Higher Education Act. And so this created priority enrollment for students experiencing homelessness, and also required schools, particularly at the community college and CSU, and requests that the UC have somebody, a designated liaison or a single point of contact to meet the needs of students experiencing homelessness in particular. So SPOC is another term for that word. Another thing AB 801 did was create a tuition waiver at community colleges. So the next bill, AB 1228, created a housing priority for students experiencing homelessness. So for schools that have and maintain housing facilities, it created a priority or a preference for the student community. And then it also asked schools to create a housing plan for these students during academic breaks, with the awareness that not every student has a home to return to. AB 1747 aimed to address some of the food insecurity. So this is the College Student Hunger Relief Act. And this required schools to participate in the restaurant meals program so that students can use their CalFresh or their SNAP benefits on campus. And this is particularly important for students experiencing homelessness that may not have a facility to cook food or have access to hot food. So that really opens up some opportunity for them and creates that connection on their school campus. It also required closer partnerships with food pantries and food banks, and encouraged SNAP enrollment. So if a student is coming to the food pantry on campus, are they also being asked about signing up for CalFresh? And to make that a bit easier, AB 1214, which came out the following year, clarifies the work-study laws so that more students can access SNAP benefits. So it kind of extended the view of what constitutes work so that more students could be eligible for that benefit, because it's particularly hard in college to qualify for CalFresh, and that's a challenge. And lastly, AB 1995, it required community college campuses that have shower facilities to grant those facilities to any homeless student who is enrolled in the school and in good standing with the community college. So being able to meet their hygiene needs. So you see with this kind of suite of laws, we're addressing housing, enrollment, food, and hygiene. So there's sort of a package there that we'll get into a little bit more. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Debbie. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Shahira. So thank you to those of you that are sending questions in. Just so you know, I'm not responding on the questions, but I am recording them for the Q&A at the end. So we'll get to all of those questions at the end. So I want to talk a little bit about the benefits that are available to homeless youth, and really focusing in on two of the key benefits, which are independent status on the FAFSA, which is governed by federal requirements, and then priority registration and access to the Promise Grant, or the otherwise known as the Board of Governors fee waiver at the community colleges. And this was put into place, as Shahira mentioned, by AB 801. And so there's similarities and differences between how youth are defined as homeless for these two different benefits. And so one of the things I'm going to do here is really walk through the legal definitions of who qualifies for these different benefits. And I mentioned earlier that there is the crosswalk handout on your control panel that you can go ahead and download, which outlines the similarities and differences between the different definitions. So I'm going to start with the FAFSA definition. So for purposes of the FAFSA, when a student is filling out the FAFSA, there's a way that they can qualify for independent status based on being homeless. And independent status means that their financial aid is determined fully based on their income, and if they're married, their partner, and that they do not have to report income from their parents. So the definition on the FAFSA to qualify for independent status as a homeless student is that on or after July 1st of the year prior to the award year, the student was homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So what does that mean exactly? So it's based on something called the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. Fundamentally, the definition of homelessness means lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate housing situation. So when you're thinking about whether somebody qualifies as a homeless student for the purposes of the FAFSA, that's really the key. What is being looked at is that they do not have fixed, regular, and adequate housing. The definition then goes on to give some examples of this. So it includes students who are sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing or economic hardship. So these would be our couch surfers who are moving from place to place. They don't have a fixed, regular, and adequate housing situation, and therefore they're sleeping on people's couches. It also includes more sort of traditionally thought of homeless, people who are sleeping in a place not designed for regular sleeping accommodation in their cars, etc. So breaking it down a little further, this definition. So there's two parts to it: unaccompanied and homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So unaccompanied means, for the purposes of the FAFSA, the student is not in the physical custody of their parent or guardian. So if a student is homeless with their parents, they're sleeping in a shelter with their parents or some other situation, they're not considered an independent student. They obviously still would apply for financial aid, but they would need to provide the income information from their parent or guardian. So that's the first part, is unaccompanied. The second part is homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So if they're homeless, if they meet that McKinney-Vento definition that I just described, lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing, or if they're self-supporting and at risk of homeless. Self-supporting is defined as when a student pays for their own living expenses, and at risk of being homeless is when a student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. So an example of this is maybe a student who has housing right now, but they're going through an eviction process and they don't have any stable housing to go to after the eviction is finalized. You don't have to wait until they're literally out of the place and on the street to qualify them as an independent student, knowing that they're in that process of getting evicted and that they don't have any place to go afterwards. Would allow them to qualify as an independent student. So who is included? I just want to sort of note a couple of things about this. It does include 22 and 23-year-olds, and I note this because there was a time a couple of years ago where youth was defined as a student up to age 21. That was changed a couple of years ago, and it now includes 22 and 23-year-olds. If you're 24, you're automatically independent. You don't have to be homeless or anything else. You're automatically considered independent. So the homeless definition becomes irrelevant at that point for the purposes of the FAFSA. A few other things that are noted in financial aid guidance: if a student is living in any of those situations and fleeing an abusive parent, they are considered homeless, even if the parent would provide support and a place to live. If a student is living in a school dorm, but doesn't have alternative housing to go to during breaks and summer, etc., that student would still be considered an unaccompanied homeless youth. And the other key thing to note about this is that a student has to re-verify as homeless every year to continue to qualify to get independent status on the FAFSA. This is actually one of the key differences between the FAFSA definition and the 801 definition for priority registration, which we'll get into in a little bit. The 801 definition doesn't require re-verification. The FAFSA independent status does require that. So how does somebody verify that they're a homeless student? Who can provide that verification? There are three entities other than a financial aid administrator who can make the determination that a student is homeless. The first is a local homeless education liaison in a K-12 system, sometimes also referred to as McKinney-Vento liaisons, and every school district has one of these. A Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funded shelter. This is a federal program, RHYA, or a shelter that's funded through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a HUD funded shelter. So these three entities, the liaison, the RHYA programs, and the HUD programs, are permitted to make this determination of homelessness. One recent change to the guidance about this is that these individuals can provide the verification of homelessness. They can make that determination in subsequent years as long as they have access to the necessary information. So maybe a student who's homeless as a high school senior, and the McKinney-Vento liaison provides the verification, the following year, maybe that student has maintained a relationship with the McKinney-Vento liaison, even though they're not in the high school district anymore, and that liaison has knowledge of the student's current housing situation. They're allowed to continue to provide that verification in subsequent years, and that's a fairly recent change. When a student fills out the FAFSA and they indicate that they are homeless, there's 4 questions basically that's on the FAFSA. So the first just is a question, on or after July 1st, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, yes or no? And then there's these 3 questions that come up. Basically, could a high school liaison verify that? Could an RHYA shelter verify that? Could a HUD-funded shelter verify that? If one of those 3 people can provide the verification, then the student would check yes in the appropriate box, and that's who would provide the verification. If the student doesn't have access to one of those, and a lot of students are not going to be working with one of those 3 entities, they can check no on all 3 of those boxes, and then it becomes a responsibility of the financial aid administrator to do the verification of homelessness. So there's a couple of links here that I wanted to share for organizations that provide templates for a determination letter. And on the slide there, you can see the language that's on the letter. And I put this on here because it's very simple and very straightforward. It's literally just, I am providing this letter to convey my determination that this student was, and then check off an unaccompanied homeless youth or an unaccompanied self-supporting youth at risk of homelessness. And the reason I wanted to share this language with you is because one of the really key things to understand is that financial aid administrators should not be assessing anything other than the question of yes or no, the student meets this definition. They shouldn't be asking about why or what are the circumstances or asking a lot of personal questions. If somebody provides this letter, all it needs to say is yes, this student meets this definition, and that is all that the financial aid office needs to receive in order to qualify the student as independent. So a couple things about these letters as well. If the student receives a determination from one of 3 entities, the financial aid office must accept the determination. So if you get it from the liaison, an RHYA shelter, RHYA funded shelter, or HUD funded shelter, that's all you need to know. Student is homeless. You can go ahead and package their financial aid. The financial aid administrator is not required to verify any of the answers unless they have conflicting information. The other thing to note is that a documented phone call from one of the authorized authorities is sufficient. So even if the student doesn't have a piece of paper verification, if you're able to have a conversation with say the McKinney-Vento liaison who confirms, yes, this student is homeless, you can make a note of that in the file. That is adequate. I will just say that the guidance provided by the Department of Education around this really points to an intention to make this verification process as easy as possible for the students. We know that these students, of course, are facing a lot of barriers in their life already, and so it's really key that we don't put additional barriers by making them jump through lots of hoops and get lots of documentation, etc. And the good news is that the guidance from the feds is very clear that that's not necessary. You really can just get a phone call or anything that allows you to document that status. A couple other things that are noted in the financial aid guidance: it is not considered conflicting information if the financial aid administrator disagrees with an authority's determination. So if a McKinney-Vento liaison says this person is homeless and the financial aid administrator is like, well, I don't know if that really counts, that's not relevant. Once they get that determination, the student should be qualified as homeless. The financial aid administrator should not request additional documentation, and this is the language directly from the application and verification guide, that doing so may appear as if the financial aid administrator is asking the student to explain or justify their circumstances. And again, the federal guidance is very clear that it's not the role of the financial aid office to have the student explain or justify. It's just to confirm yes or no the student meets the definition. What if the student doesn't have, isn't able to get verification from one of these three official providers? In that case, it then does fall on the financial aid administrator to make the determination. And again, the financial aid administrator has quite a lot of leeway in terms of how that determination is made. So they can get verification from a variety of third parties as well as from the student themselves. So some of the third parties would be college access programs like TRIO, healthcare providers, social workers, mental health professionals. There's quite a long list of folks that can provide verification that the student does meet the definition of homelessness. Couple other things to note about this. The financial aid administrator, again, should determine just if the student is unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being so, without regard for why the student is homeless. There's definitely students who have shared that they felt like a financial aid administrator asked a lot of personal questions that weren't necessarily necessary for making the determination. So just to be really careful and think through what you're asking the student and really just asking the minimal amount that you need to make that determination. And then finally on this, again, the financial aid guidance is very clear that if there's no written documentation available, the determination can be based on a documented interview with the student. So a lot of times if a student, say, is sleeping in their car, they haven't necessarily made a connection with a doctor or a social worker or a college program that's helping them with their homelessness or who knows about the fact that they're homeless. You don't need that third-party verification. You can just ask the student to explain what their living situation is. And if they explain to you that they're sleeping in their car, you can just take notes, write that down, put that in the file, and that interview is adequate documentation for making the determination that the student qualifies as an independent student. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessica. I know that was a lot of information quickly, but now Jessica is going to talk about the definition of homelessness as it relates to 801, which again is a little different from the FAFSA. Jessica?
Thank you, Debbie. Hello, everyone. This is Jessica Smith over at the Foundation for California Community Colleges. I'm going to talk, like Debbie said, a little bit about AB 801 and how that affects our homeless youth students on community college campuses. So Assembly Bill 801, AB 801, it actually went into effect as of January 1st of last year. So it's been around for a little while, but we're still trying to get the word out on exactly what that looks like on your campus. And so I'm just going to jump right in to some of the verification of AB 801 since we're already in that sort of space talking about FAFSA verification. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the verification conversation and then the role of the homeless youth liaison itself. So AB 801, as Shahara mentioned, it does require the community colleges and the CSUs to have a homeless youth liaison. And those homeless youth liaison, the homeless youth, as you can see on the slide, is defined by a student who is under age 25 and who has been verified at any time during the 24 months preceding the application as being homeless, using that same McKinney-Vento definition that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. Next slide, please. So with AB 801, as I said, it institutes a homeless youth liaison, but it also provides benefits to students who are verified as homeless and who meet those two requirements that I just mentioned, so being under age 25 and being verified within 24 months preceding the application. And so the homeless youth, once the student is verified, they are automatically eligible for the California College Promise Grant, also known as the BOG fee waiver, as long as the student meets the minimum academic and progress standards, and they are also eligible to receive priority registration. Next slide, please. So in speaking a little bit more about verification, a student, I'm going to talk about how a student can be verified in the next slide, but once a student is verified, they retain that status for a period of up to 6 years or until they reach age 25, so whichever one of those comes first. I know Debbie just mentioned that with the FAFSA verification, it is something that needs to happen every year. With AB 801, the verification does not need to happen every year. Once the student gets the verification, that verification sticks with them until they turn 25. And so unless they switch to a different college or even outside of the district, it's pretty easy to maintain that verification. Really all that needs to happen is the homeless youth liaison from the campus that provided the verification in their original school can just make a phone call to the homeless youth liaison at the new school or in the new district, and they can have a documented phone call, a documented interview, a documented conversation with each other saying, yes, the student was verified on my campus, here's the documentation that I have, and theoretically that student can continue with that verification in their new college. And the way that students would become verified for homelessness in the first place is typically they're going to just be informing their financial aid advisor of their situation. And per AB 801, in order to be eligible for these benefits, the priority reg and the BOG fee waiver, the status can be verified by 3 entities similar to the FAFSA, but just a tiny bit different. So a homeless service provider, there's a bunch of different ways that that's defined in the italic at the bottom of the slide. And I wanted to note that one of those entities is the local education liaison, and I think that's typically the most commonly utilized one. Next, you can be verified through the federal TRIO program or a GEAR Up program. And then lastly, as we had talked about before with FAFSA, a financial aid administrator at the institution can also make that verification and can make that determination. Now, I wanted to mention that the Chancellor's Office is also working with the legislature currently to expand that jurisdiction to also have the homeless youth liaisons themselves be able to provide that verification as well. And we hope to see that be put in place by the beginning of this upcoming year. And so that way the homeless youth liaison that's required by the AB 801 legislation can also provide that verification when working with their students directly. Next slide, please. So as Debbie had mentioned just a little bit ago, the verification conversation, if it's coming from the financial aid administrator or upcoming the homeless youth liaison, she had mentioned, and I wanted to reiterate that the goal of this conversation is not to have the student justify why they're homeless. It's to find out if they're homeless per the McKinney-Vento definition, and to make the verification process as smooth as possible. So really what these questions are trying to get to the bottom of is if that student is lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate place to stay. And that's really the bottom line with the McKinney-Vento definition, and something that you want to keep in mind when you're asking these questions is to find out, is the student's housing situation fixed, regular, or adequate? So I wanted to reiterate what Debbie was saying in terms of being sensitive to these kinds of conversations, and of course assuring the student that the conversations are confidential, that they're just used to make this verification of McKinney-Vento definition homelessness. And these questions can be pretty simple. I think some of them on here are just basically asking, like, tell me about your living situation, or maybe even just asking the student if they relate to any of the arrangements described in this definition. But once again, this is to find out if that definition is being met, and not necessarily why the student is in the situation they're in. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've kind of already touched on the requirements of AB 801. So apart from the benefits that the students receive, the priority registration and the California College Promise Grant, AB 801 is also requiring somebody either within financial aid or in another appropriate office or department to function as the homeless youth liaison. And that liaison is responsible for making sure that homeless youth or youth experiencing homelessness are understanding their eligibility for financial aid, for FAFSA, for the BOG fee waiver and the priority registration, and that they are there to assist these students in applying for and receiving these financial aid and other services. As we've seen, the process can get a little bit confusing and murky, and so really the role of the homeless youth liaison in this capacity is to just sort of guide the students through each of the different types of processes for independent student status on the FAFSA or AB 801 eligibility and things like that. And then, of course, the AB 801 also requires the colleges to inform current or prospective homeless students about these financial aid requirements or other types of assistance available, whether that's something that's specific to that campus or something that's specific to that community. The idea is that the homeless youth liaison would sort of have an overall understanding of sort of what else is out there besides FAFSA or AB 801 that we can use to help some of our students who maybe for whatever reason, because of their age or other things, aren't actually eligible for some of the benefits provided by the law. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is just getting into the role of the homeless youth liaison a little bit more, which I know Bianca's going to speak to even more, but as I had already mentioned, this person, the homeless youth liaison, is really just there to be a point of contact. I know Shahara had mentioned that something that really a lot of the homeless youth students mentioned in their focus groups was connection to a supportive adult, and this homeless youth liaison can be one of those supportive adults who can point them either to other supportive adults or other resources. Like I said, not all of our homeless youth that are coming through our campuses, unfortunately, are going to be eligible for all of the benefits that the legislation provides. So really this is about seeing what else is out there and being able to work with each of our homeless youth students in whatever capacity that may look like. Next slide. And once again, the slide pretty much describes what we are already saying. So, but really acting as a liaison, so not just between the youth and yourself, but also yourself as the homeless youth liaison and community partnerships or other resources that are available out in the community. And then, of course, as I mentioned, making determinations regarding eligibility for priority reg and promise grant eligibility. And although the homeless youth liaison currently is not included in the language of AB 801 to make that determination, stay tuned. Hopefully that will be changing, and we are working on getting that changed so that the homeless youth liaison will eventually be able to also provide that verification for their homeless youth students. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Bianca, and she's going to get into more detail about the role of the homeless youth liaison itself.
Hi, my name is Bianca Beesine. I'm the Student Equity Coordinator at Imperial Valley College, and I'm also the Homeless Liaison. And I just noticed I'm experiencing some technical difficulties, so if you could bear with me real quick, I'm back in. Next slide, please. Today I'll be speaking to you about Imperial Valley College's resilient students, and these are the populations of students who are experiencing the highest amount of vulnerabilities, and what supportive services we'll be offering these students to ensure that we're accountable for their academic success. I'm also going to be offering basic first steps that any liaison can take to implement supportive services or improve already what's existing on your campus. And the intention is to provide tips and helpful ideas that when you don't have enough money in your budget or enough staffing to be able to support students. Next slide. At Imperial Valley College specifically, we've recognized that we have specific students experiencing various vulnerabilities. So often we experience one student coming to us who initially started off in the foster youth system and statistically became involved in the juvenile justice system, became incarcerated, was released from incarceration, and due to their involvement in incarceration, were unable to secure employment, therefore couldn't afford housing. So we're experiencing a large population of students on our campus who are layered throughout all of these populations. And currently right now, as the homeless liaison, I work with 95 identified homeless students. And what we're seeing is after providing several supportive services to these populations, they have a higher success rate, a completion rate, and graduation rate on campus in comparison to the general population who has not been identified as belonging to one of these three populations. Next slide, please. So after we identified the population that we're working with, our resilient students on campus, we decided that we needed to identify the basic needs, that basically what barriers are these students experiencing that are getting in the way of their academic success. So we identified that the majority of these resilient students are experiencing housing insecurities, food insecurities, and inability to access showers or even purchase hygiene items, as well as pay for transportation or textbooks. So we identified these major barriers experienced by our students. Next slide, please. And what we decided to do was our leadership team decided to be thoughtful and intentional and hire employees who have a background in working with the homeless population. So I have previous experience of working with the chronically homeless population as the homeless liaison, and several of my colleagues also provide social services. They're work in the social services field, or they're pursuing education in psychology. And our leadership just really promoted bringing on individuals in the department who have a background in homelessness or serving our resilient population. We decide to look at each student and just kind of meet them where they are and provide housing referrals and more of like brokering case management services, where we eliminate barriers and silos on our campus to ensure that we're referring students throughout different departments to just give like a real holistic approach and really focus on providing like basic things like sitting with a student and creating a renter's budget, or even calling a landlord on their behalf when we have the time. And we also keep a stack of public assistance and housing programs in our department that's been really helpful for students. We are compliant with legislation to provide access to showers for our students. We recognized that, yes, the legislation does validate that our students are having issues accessing showers, but we figured as an institution that it's pretty much common sense. If our students are having problems accessing showers, they probably can't afford shampoo. So we decided to provide shower kits for our students. And while we didn't have a lot of funding for it, we got creative and decided to encourage students and faculty and staff that when they travel out to conferences to bring back their unused like shampoo and soap and mouthwash bottles and things of that sort. And that's been really helpful and friendly to our budget. We also are compliant with priority registration for our homeless youth. Next slide, please. So when we identified that textbooks were a major barrier for our students, we had students coming in letting us know that they were going to drop their courses because they couldn't afford a $400 biology textbook. So we decided to provide textbook grants to our students in the form of vouchers. And initially, students were very resistant to accepting the help because it was a help-seeking barrier. They were very resistant. They saw it as a handout, and we weren't utilizing the services, or students weren't utilizing the lending library as we had thought. So we ended up, well, they weren't utilizing the book vouchers. We ended up developing the lending library, which gave an opportunity for students to pay it forward. So when a student would come to us and ask for a textbook and was resistant to accepting the help, we empowered them and let them know that would you be able to bring this textbook back to us at the end of the academic term in order to give that textbook to another homeless student or another formerly incarcerated student or another foster youth who's in your same shoes? And students responded very well to it and started utilizing our lending library. It was completely friendly to our budget because we had initially been spending thousands and thousands of dollars on textbook grants, which obviously isn't sustainable for some of the funding that we were using. And we ended up purchasing textbooks and then recycling them through our lending library, so it was budget friendly and also promoted empowerment with our students. Next slide, please. And in order to address food insecurity that was experienced by several of our populations on campus, back in October, we opened up the IVC Kitchen for a Better Tomorrow. It's our campus food pantry and our intervention to address food insecurity on campus. We were identifying students that were having issues and literally did not know where their next meal was going to come from, or are the main breadwinners for their household when they have children or elderly parents to take care of. So we decided to develop a hybrid solution. First and foremost, we recognize that the most successful and sustainable approach and intervention to food insecurity and hunger is the CalFresh program. So we do recognize that, and we also do provide immediate short-term and long-term solutions to food insecurity. We serve 100 students per day and 50 families per month. And this is amazing because we're not just touching the lives of one student. That student is able to, reap the service and the support that we're offering here and bring it back to their families. And many of those are former IVC students, like elderly parents. Next slide, please. And we decided to provide on-site meals. This was a thoughtful and intentional decision because we recognized that our homeless students who are on campus, if we gave them a bag of frozen chicken and milk and eggs, they wouldn't have the ability or the access to cook, store, or prepare food. So we needed to design some type of intervention that would be able to meet that need for that specific population on campus. We also provide take-home groceries for some homeless students who do have access to cook, store, and provide food, like those who are couch surfing. And we also provide it to all students on campus, regardless of income coming in, as long as they can identify that they are experiencing food insecurity. We do have an eligibility process, a small screening process for our students. They are able to provide to receive take-home groceries. We also recently became a distribution site with our local food bank, which we're very grateful for because we are now in the USDA Commodities and TFAP program. That's at no cost to our institution. So it's great because we actually get monthly food deliveries of like literally 400 pounds of frozen chicken, gallons of milk and juice and beans, staple foods, where when you do a food drive on campus, you often receive, canned goods and non-perishable items. We have the capacity to accept perishable items because we're enrolled in this federal program. We also utilize our local food bank's CalFresh outreach grant, where they have an individual there whose main mission and goal is to screen individuals in the community to set them up for CalFresh benefits. This is the most sustainable solution, and we're lucky enough to be able to utilize their resource. Next slide, please. And here's a picture, the one on the left. We recently brought on an AmeriCorps site, and those are 3 of our AmeriCorps members handing out fresh produce. We don't only give out perishable, like staple goods. We also give out tomatoes, produce, and these are all from local farmers in both in the county and in Sacramento. And on the right, you'll see it's kind of a fun picture. This is on Halloween. We have a lot of community involvement with our donors. We are a small town, but we do have an amazing support system. This is literally the CEO of a local bank branch is here, and their business office. They come together and they just really promote awareness for food insecurity on campus. Next slide, please. And just to share with you some basic first steps that your campus can utilize, I do recognize that not every campus has, a lot of staffing, or maybe you're having issues with your budget. These are all either free or low to no cost approaches and creative usage of volunteers in order to get you where you need to be to provide supportive services. So first and foremost, you need to learn about your students, identify the basic needs. Is it housing? Is it food? Is it clothing that's getting in the way of their academic success? Take an assets-based approach. Conduct an inventory internally of who is it on campus that can help you. Is there any existing funding? Who's the donor that's most friendly with us and is really looking to get on board with our cause? And identify. There is always somebody on campus who has historically and naturally been interested in community service. The person who organizes your food drives, the student government or club or faculty who offers extra credit. Basically identify who your champions are on campus, internally, and buy them in to supplement the fact that you have a tight budget or don't have enough staffing. Next slide, please. And identify those staff, faculty, or students on campus who have a history of working with homeless and foster formerly incarcerated populations. And like I said earlier, keep a stack of public housing applications on hand. If you can go the extra mile and assist the student with filling out, that's great. But for those of us who are really busy, just having a copy is helpful. At least we can get the student on the waiting list. And it's important to let them know not to be discouraged. Most students get discouraged because locally our waiting list is 3 to 5 years for public housing, and students don't even want to fill out the application because of that sometimes, but we let them know that other people have been waiting 3 to 5 years and tend to back out or find other types of housing, and they may be moved up quicker. And most importantly, identify community partners who are experts in the basic needs in your community. This is key. We need to be humble and recognize that as an institution, as a college, as a university, just an academic institution, we are not the experts in a food bank or in providing Salvation Army, the clothing. We can be great at it, but there are others who are out there who their sole mission and organization serves that need. So make friends with those people in the community, develop MOUs, and identify who, one example is we're currently receiving assistance from, the CalFresh Outreach Grant. Those individuals need to meet a quota in terms of their applications, but they also share the genuine commitment to serving individuals experiencing hunger. And we have a need on campus and not enough resources, time, or money to serve that need. So I encourage everybody to identify their local CalFresh Outreach Grant recipient. Use AmeriCorps members if you can locally when you don't have staff, and research the USDA TFAP program. That will bring staple foods to your site if a food drive isn't working. And I just hope these tips are very helpful for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Debbie.
Great, thank you so much, Bianca. So a couple quick announcements before we do Q&A. I wanted to let people know about a bill in the legislature right now, Senate Bill 918, authored by Senator Anthony Weiner and co-authored by Assemblymember Rubio. And this would provide $60 million of funding for grants to nonprofits and homeless continuum of care entities, specifically to serve homeless youth, along with funding for the creation of an Office of Homeless Youth. And if you're interested in getting involved in this, there's information on the John Burton Advocates for Youth website, and I'll send that out after the presentation, where you can send in a support letter, come to committee hearings, meet with legislators in your district, and encourage youth to get involved in this effort. There's a few hearings coming up in Sacramento, April 10th and April 24th. If you might be available to come testify at one of those hearings, you can reach out to us, and we'd love to have you there. I also wanted to let folks know about the Community College Basic Needs Summit, which is coming up in Sacramento on April 26th and 27th. Should be a really great event. The link is there for registration. Again, I'll send all this information out in an email to everybody who registered for the webinar. Here's the contact information of folks. Again, this will all be included in the PowerPoint that goes out at the end. And we have gotten a lot of questions coming in. We just have a few minutes, so I'll try to get to as many as I can. The first question, Shahira, is for you. Is 801 just for community colleges, or does it also apply to CSUs?
Hey there, Sahara back, just take myself off on mute. So AB 801 does apply to community colleges as well as CSUs, and it requests that UCs also participate in having single points of contact. So, UCs aren't governed by the legislature, they're governed by the UC regions. So the answer is yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Jessica, I'm going to put this next question to you. You had mentioned in talking about the 801 definition that you had to be homeless during the 24 months prior to applying for school. Can a student be considered homeless for the purposes of 801 and priority registration if they become homeless after they start school? Jessica?
Yes.
There?
Sorry. Yes, I had to also unmute myself. I apologize. Yes, the guidance that the Chancellor's Office has recommended is that if a student does become homeless after applying or during enrollment or sometime during the school year, that student would just need to notify the financial aid office of this status change, and then of course they would need to go through that same verification process with the financial aid office to gain the verification the same way that any other student would, and then the financial aid office can make the adjustment. And then of course if enrollment has already happened, they may not get in priority enrollment that year or whatever that looks like, but from that point forward then the student would have that verification for the subsequent years that they're in college.
Okay, thanks. So Bianca, the next question is for you. Do you do anything in the work that you do with the homeless students? Do you do anything where you provide an audit of students' financial aid to make sure they're fully accessing everything that they're eligible for? And if so, are you learning anything from it? Do you find that most homeless students are able to be categorized as independent students?
Yes, so we do find that the majority of our resilient population, the students we're serving, specifically are homeless youth, and we also serve homeless adults. They do identify as independent students. We have a very good collaboration with our financial aid department, who an advocate that's housed in there that handles the majority of the screening. We do utilize a banner system that gives us access to financial aid, how much disbursement each student is going to receive. We do have an internal process where we take a look at all of the bills that the student has to pay. So we kind of take like a renter's budget, or just to get a whole a whole idea of what the student has to pay for and which would prevent paying for food and items of that sort. But the majority of the students that we are serving either aren't eligible for financial aid or have maxed out, or are in the middle of petitioning. So that's what I've seen so far with the 95 that we're working with.
Great, thanks. Another question for you, Bianca. Can you say a little bit more about how you became the USDA distribution site? Like, what's the process for that?
Sure. Well, there is a website available. I can share that later. But we visited our local food bank and talked to the executive director and let them know that we had a huge need of food insecurity and hunger experiencing on our campus. And we asked if we could become a distribution site, because each food bank, local food bank that engages in the USDA federal program, rather than having food distributed from one site, like one building in one city, they branch out to multiple locations like churches or like locally Catholic charities, or maybe like bigger community centers, and they identify these distribution sites throughout a county in order to reach more people and control flow. So when you do talk to your local food bank, ask if they participate in the USDA TFAP program. It's also known as the Commodities Program, and you ask if you can become a distribution site yourself. It is free. The only cost to us is we do pay a transportation fee because we don't have a refrigerated truck. So we utilize the local food bank's refrigerated truck to deliver to our site. And it's pretty simple, but the main thing is you need a space on campus to refrigerate your items. And if you can't afford a refrigerator or a chest freezer, you can get one donated like we did from Lowe's and Home Depot. And if you can't have a space provided on your campus, you can't secure one, then what you can also do is what some of our local distribution sites don't have an area to store the food. They just set up kind of like a farmer's market, and people come outside on one day for the event and distribute food items once a month rather than us who spread the distribution dates throughout the month 4 times a month because we have the space.
Great, thank you. So we are unfortunately at time. We're actually a couple minutes over time. So I apologize to those of you who we didn't get your questions answered. You'll get an email from me following this webinar with various follow-up information. If you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to send your question directly to me via email, and I will do my best to try to get that answered. And I want to say a huge thank you to our 3 panelists today and to everybody on the webinar for all your great questions. And that concludes this morning's web seminar.